If everyone could take a seat, we're running a few minutes late already, so we're about ready to begin. Okay. We are, so we're nearing the end. It's been a wonderful weekend, I think. Is this your first Karachi public event?
This is my first Karachi public event.
Welcome to Karachi.
Yeah, I'm a neophyte.
There's a big Karachi welcome. So I first heard of Daniyal Mueenuddin a few years ago when my friend, the writer Nadeem Aslam, called me up and he said, "Who's this Daniyal Mueenuddin?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Haven't you read The New Yorker?" And within about 48 hours, the number of people who were sort of calling me or I was running into who were saying, "Who is this Daniyal Mueenuddin?" Because Daniyal had a story in The New Yorker, and some of you may already know this, some may not. There is no more prized literary real estate certainly in America, possibly in the English language publishing world, than The New Yorker. There are many writers who have a very long and distinguished publishing history and never get into The New Yorker. And there was this guy who didn't even have a book and didn't have, as far as anyone knew, a book contract, and he had somehow landed himself in The New Yorker with an amazing story, which everyone I know sort of fell in love with, about an electrician called Nawabuddin. And so it was really sort of, it was one of those moments where this sort of buzz went around. Who's this guy? When is there a book coming out? And I had a slightly embarrassing moment, which was a friend of mine who's editor-in-chief of Random House India emailed me with the question I kept hearing, she said, "What do you know anything about Daniyal Mueenuddin?" By now I had spoken to my mother and forwarded the story to him, and so I sort of sent back this very desi kind of, my grandfather knew his grandfather and my mother, da-da-da-da-da. And she wrote back and she said, "That's nice, dear. What's his email address?" So it was one of the more foolish moments of my life. But anyway, a book did appear in Other Rooms, Other Wonders, and went on to be, I think, one of the most talked about debuts in recent times, shortlisted or won pretty much every prize that a collection of short stories can be up for, including the National Book Award and the Pulitzer. It won the Story Award. Story Prize, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for First Book, and a whole host of others. And Daniyal is going to afford us a rare privilege, I think, which is to read something which hasn't been published.
Right.
So if you want to explain what...
Yeah. I'm going to stand up, if that thing works. Hello? Yeah, good. Okay, I have a whole file, I have a whole file on my computer, which I have titled Outtakes and Bloopers. And this is the pieces of stories that, for one reason or another, didn't make it into this book, but it concerns sort of the same characters. And at some point, I'm supposedly going to finish these stories and publish them. So this is taken from that file. And what the story is about it's somewhat autobiographical, but not really, in that it's about if you don't know my history, I went to college in America and then came back here and took over my father's farm, and sort of was very much green behind the ears, or whatever they call it, when I showed up and didn't really know anything. And this story is sort of describing this young guy named Azmat has just showed up at this farm, and the farm is controlled by the munshis, the managers, and these guys are running rings around him and making a fool of him. So this is sort of describing his coming to the realization that he's completely out of his depth, which I also came to at some point. And with no further ado, so in this sort of taken from the middle of the book, increasingly it dawned upon Azmat that the farm had become unmanageable, the situation much worse than he had suspected when he first moved there. During the Bhutto land reforms 10 years earlier, Salim is the head munshi. During the Bhutto land reforms 10 years earlier, Salim had convinced his father, the father of this guy, had convinced K.K. Gurmani, Azmat's father, legally to transfer some property into the names of others so that family members wouldn't hold more land than the anticipated ceilings. The old man who no longer traveled, not even to the farm, gave Salim unlimited powers of attorney, permitting him to arrange the transfers. Many nominees were members of Salim's extended family or the families of other junior managers. And now, when Azmat tried to reverse the transfers, he found innumerable obstacles in his way. The relevant portions of the official land records were reported to have been eaten by termites, and the land records in the Gurmani farm office had supposedly been destroyed and thrown away when a water pipe broke. One day, when they were walking through the fields of newly planted emerald wheat, Azmat turned to Salim. "How much land do you own, Manager Sahib?" "Oh, a few acres, enough to give me fodder for my buffaloes." Azmat stopped and looked Salim in the face. "And where is your land?" "Let's put it this way. Wherever you have land, I also hold something, a bit here and a bit there." I'll actually translate this for you into Punjabi, because this actually happened, and it was very funny. I said to him, "Choi sahab, ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਜ਼ਮੀਨ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਹੈ?" He said, "ਮੀਆਂ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਮਝ ਲਓ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਡੀ ਵੀ ਹੋਏਗੀ." And how did you get this land? What do you think? He permitted himself to show annoyance. "I bought some of it, as you know, from your father. May you rest in peace. I sold land that my family owned in Laya. Please send somebody to check on it." Of course, Salim stole water and fertilizer and labor and tractor hours from the Gurmani farm. Azmat guessed that he acquired some of his holdings by removing the land from the farm ledgers, transferring it into his children's names, and getting the revenue officials to backdate the transfers into the miasma of the past. Azmat could do nothing. He asked the accountant to make a list of all his lands, but this showed him holding just 800 acres and almost nothing near the city, where the land would be most valuable. There must be more. He decided to visit the office of the Tehsildar, the land revenue officer in Khanpur, keeping up with Salim, the pretense that they together wished to solve the problem. The Tehsildar, the second most important revenue official in Khanpur after the assistant commissioner, had his offices in a crumbling British-era building near the old city, made of bricks with deep verandas and archways. Onto this had been appended strangely incongruous additions, including a tin-roofed portico painted with glossy blue and white stripes, sheltering the Tehsildar's official jeep. Azmat drove in under an old peepal tree, stopped the car, and hopped out without turning off the engine, leaving the driver to park. Salim fell in behind him, and they walked up to the door, guarded by a peon wearing a dirty white uniform, somewhat like a sailor suit with brass buttons. Azmat had never been to this office before. "Gurmani," he announced to the peon, "please tell the Tehsildar Sahab." Salim leaned forward and whispered in Azmat's ear, "Go on in." In the room, 6 or 7 men were sitting on a line of chairs, arrayed in front of a large desk. Behind the desk sat the Tehsildar, a short Punjabi with very thick black hair parted to the side, wearing elaborate golden-framed glasses with the interlocking Chanel monogram on each side. His starched white shalwar were of a satiny cotton, and his gold cufflinks were matched for brilliance only by his gold pen, which lay on his desk in front of him, pinning down some papers. By contrast, the chairs were rickety and of cheap wood, the floors bare concrete and slippery with dust, and worst of all, a strong smell of urine escaped from a little toilet that had been built by walling off a corner of the room, the Tehsildar presumably being unwilling to enter the even more foul common latrines. The Tehsildar looked up owlishly, regarded Azmat, and continued speaking to one of the men arrayed in front of him. "So, he told that son of a bitch that judge or no judge, they were confiscating those videotapes." Azmat took one of the seats pushed against the wall, very aware that the other visitors were of a crude social class, hangers-on to government officials, penny lawyers, and various kinds of fixers. Already he regretted having come. Salim, with a friendly smile on his face, his teeth very white, stepped forward to the desk. The Tehsildar jumped up, and not content with shaking Salim's hand, walked around to the side of his desk and embraced him. "Assalamu alaikum, Chaudhry Sahib," said the Tehsildar. "But why have you come here? You should have called me and I would have waited upon you in Dunyapur." Still looking into Salim's face, he reached around on the table with his other hand, found the telephone, lifted the receiver, and muttered to the steno to send tea. Chaudhry Salim beamed at the Tehsildar. The Tehsildar re-beamed at Chaudhry Salim. "Please, please." The Tehsildar motioned to the men sitting in front of the desk. who instantly vacated their seats. Azmat awkwardly rose from his seat on the side and moved to one of the places of honor facing the revenue officer. The Tehsildar now, for the first time, looked with interest at Azmat. You must, in fact, be the young master of Dunyapur, Mia Azmat Gurmani. Conscious of the eyes upon him, which seemed amused and unsympathetic, Azmat began a long-winded description of his recent movements. Yes, I've come to take control of the farm. I've just come from America. I was at school there for a number of years, though I came back every summer. The Tehsildar cut him off. I see, most welcome, I see. So, Chaudhry Salim, how are your crops? All is well? With your blessings, responded Salim, lowering his eyes piously, as if right there receiving the blessings of the Tehsildar. The peon brought mixed tea in small, crudely made cups with a rose design, and also a little plate of biscuits. He served Azmat first, and when Azmat proffered the biscuits, the Tehsildar said in English, "Please, you take some, I take after you." He even put another biscuit onto Azmat's plate. "Have more," he said in English. One of the men sitting on the chairs, backed up against the wall, asked, "Are you then the son of Mr. K.K. Gurmani?" The Tehsildar gestured. "This is Mr. Aftab Varej, whose uncle is a leading advocate of Kanpur and our member of Punjab Assembly." Varej leaned forward and shook Azmat's hand. The Tehsildar removed an imported cigarette from a box lying on the table and snapped open a trick lighter shaped like a tiny pistol. "Do you smoke?" Azmat declined. Fixing his eyes on Azmat, the Tehsildar gulped the smoke greedily, held it, allowed trickles to escape his mouth, and inhaled it up his nose, a cycle. His eyes blazed with interest. As if he had come to some decision, he stubbed the full cigarette on the ashtray, excused himself, and went into the improvised toilet at the end of the room. Because the walls didn't reach to the ceiling, the bystanders could hear him moving about, then silence and more silence. "Should I come give you a little hand? I'd love to do that for you," called Varej. "If you were really coming, you wouldn't ask first," Rai posted the Tehsildar over the wall. I'll also translate this into Punjabi because it's very funny, although a little bit crude. This actually happened. I was in this Tehsildar's office, and this guy who was sitting there said, so we went into the toilet and we could all hear him, but nothing was happening in there. So finally he said, the Varej guy, this MPA, said, "Aun, aun," and the Tehsildar said, "Aan ale poch ke nahi aunde." Excuse me, that was rather rude. They heard him pissing, and then the Tehsildar resumed his desk. Azmat felt this too as an insult. Awkwardly speaking up, he said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've come because I need the land revenue records for Dunyapur, everything from the last 10 years. Mr. Varej leaned forward, said, "Oh, but those records have been lost in the 81 floods, not to mention the termites. Look over there, look at the state of things." Moldering dog-eared papers bound up with cloth stood in teetering piles along the walls behind the Tehsildar. "Absolute crime," agreed the Tehsildar. "Should I have one of my men come and help with the search?" "It's hopeless. You'll have to get the duplicates from Lahore, but I warn you, the situation is worse than here. What you really should do is get Chaudhry Salim to make up a rough list of your holdings, and then we'll work on that and see what we can find." He turned to Varej and began discussing something about a new watercourse, very apparently having finished with Azmat, who finally stood up and said he must go.
Thank you. One of the things that listening to you I was reminded of was how much I really admire in your work. They're not these sort of huge fireworks, but they are sort of quiet detonations all over the page. And there are ways in which you give us characters just by a little detail. I mean, in that it was full of them. One of my favorite was the man with a trick lighter shaped like a tiny pistol, and you think, that tells me what I need to know about this guy. And it's a very effective way of getting characterization across, that we don't have sort of huge bits of dialogue and huge bits of sort of description. And of course, sorry.
Sorry, you can finish.
Go.
Yeah. Well, I think that, no, exactly. I'll answer this part and then you can do the next part.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I think that's one of the really most fun and also most complicated part of the craft of writing is what's left unsaid, which is what you're speaking about. I mean, fiction is, when you're writing it, and also when you're reading it. When you're writing it, I think fiction is defined by sort of the absences as much as by what's present on the page, because it's such an intense process of selection, that you leave out so much, and so much has to be implied. And I think that's one of the really fun things about fiction and about writing fiction, is that you're creating this world, but it's all sort of smoke and mirrors, because what you're doing is, putting a little piece here and a little piece here, and then letting the reader with his experience and knowledge fill in those parts. And that's what makes reading such a collaborative and an active process, that you don't know what that tehsildar looks like, but you've seen a guy with a trick lighter, and so in your mind, it's not going to be what was in my mind. I've just given you little indications, and then you, very actively working upon this, are going to make those other pieces. And this is, of course, why TV rots your brain, for example, because TV doesn't require you to do any of that. TV, you just sit there and sort of eat your potato chips, and the whole thing happens to you.